This episode of Order from Ashes is part of Shia Power Comes of Age, the transformation of Islamist politics in Iraq. This Century International project explores the transformation of Shia Islamist politics in Iraq since the U.S. invasion in 2003. In the first episode, I spoke with Sajjad Jayad about the exact nature of that transformation and what its significance is for politics in Iraq and politics and lived experience more widely. In the second episode, I spoke with Marcin El-Shamari about the question of whether clerics have had their influence diminished as they've been able to play a more central role in politics. Today, I'm speaking with Taif Alkhudary about protest politics and the alternate course they're trying to chart. And in the fourth and final episode in the series, I'll be talking with Ali Al-Maulawi about the uncomfortable coexistence of a history of sectarian prejudice against Shia in Iraq with the ascent of Shia Islamist factions to political preeminence. You're listening to Order from Ashes. I'm Thanasi Kambanis at Century International. Today, we have another installment in the Shia Politics Working Group series. Today, I'm talking to Taif Alkhudary about her research into the revolutionary parties in Iraq and what kinds of ideas they have developed in the years since their Tishreen protest movement overthrew one government and for a while was the central event in Iraqi politics. Taif, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
Now, it might seem like to a listener like a weird bedfellow to have the revolutionary protest politics in a study of Shia politics in Iraq, but I guess to contextualize things, the starting question here was in an environment that's dominated by politics that's usually coded in terms of sect or sectarian affiliation, the Tishreen movement in 2019 was resolutely something else. So why don't you start by explaining to us what was the sort of central idea or identity of the Tishreen political the politics of Tishreen, and how did that differ from the general dominant context in Iraq?
Sure. So all we had on the 1st of October 2019 were big protests. These were protests that were largely, so they were very similar to protests that had come before at the beginning. So protests that had taken place in 2015 and 2011, where people were calling for services, for an end to corruption, and for employment opportunities. Then what we saw in October 2019 was a huge use of violence. And this use of coercion against protesters basically meant that their message changed. So they started calling for an overhaul of the type of political system that was implemented in Iraq after 2003. And this political system, which is based on a form of power sharing, empowered a group of sectarian elites who've basically ruled Iraq since then. And so faced with this, protesters started calling for the overhaul of the system. And they said, we no longer want to be represented on the basis of our sect, as had been the case since 2003. But instead, they wanted to be represented as Iraqis. So in terms of them being Iraqi citizens as opposed to members of particular sects or particular ethnic communities.
And this, as I recall, was a sort of seminal manifestation of a nationalist impulse. It wasn't by any means the first or only expression of this desire in public life in Iraq post Saddam after the U.S. invasion. There have been many individuals and groups along the way that have expressed an interest in something other than this terrible sort of sectarian power sharing system. What distinguished Tishreen from the preceding, whether it was protest movements or political actors or others who had voiced a similar interest in the previous 15 years of having something, an Iraqi system rather than a sectarian spoils system?
So I think even at the beginning, when this system was being implemented, there were a lot of people who were criticizing it. So when the Iraqi elites and their allies, their foreign allies, were coming up with the ideas for what post-2003 Iraq would look like, a lot of people already said at the time that this would only lead to violence and that it would lead to the sectarianization of society and politics. And what we saw with the protests, for example, in 2011 and 2015, was that although we saw large numbers of people out on the streets during these times, they were largely calling for reform. By 2019, that had really shifted. And people started calling for the overhaul of the political system because they saw that the people who were supposed to be representing them on the basis of their sects, so for example, the Shia politicians who are supposed to be representing the Shia population and ensuring the kind of discrimination that they saw under Saddam Hussein wouldn't reoccur, were the politicians who were oppressing that very same population. And so what we saw in 2019 was really the development, one, of protesters' demands, and two, the development of this sort of unitary nationalist identity that had already started to emerge in 2015.
So in the years since, I mean, this was a huge and very brave movement. At least 600 unarmed protesters were killed in the early phases of Tishreen. The status quo political parties who seemed to agree on nothing else seemed to agree on using any and all resources of state violence and repression to try and crush this movement. So in the years since, we have, I mean, I guess 3+ years now to assess. What has been the political legacy of Tishreen? What political parties or political ideas or other structures have come out of Tishreen that can represent this unitary nationalist idea that you were just talking about?
I mean, I think there are three things we can talk about. The first thing is that for many protesters, the legacy of Tishreen is that it really made them see politics anew. They saw that there were new ways of imagining or reimagining Iraqi politics, which is something that hadn't really been the case in 2015 and 2011. I think for a lot of them, this is what has stuck with them. For others, it saw the emergence of not political parties as such, but organizations that are working on raising political consciousness within Iraq, and in particular working with Iraqi youth on these kinds of issues. And then a smaller group of protesters who were prominent during the mobilization itself have formed political parties. And through the formation of these political parties, they've basically tried to operationalize the ideas that were developed during the protests. So this idea of having civic parties where sort of sect does not feature prominently in its membership and who they say they represent and the way that they do politics in parliament. So I think these are the three main legacies of Tishreen.
And we're gonna have, I think, considerable time to talk about the backlash. But I want to start with I think the most important part of what you've identified in your work, which is affirmatively and creatively what these different groups and movements stand for, in addition to what they stand against. And I think this is a really, I think it's a critical part of the ethnography and research you've done, which is sort of asking like, okay, like, yes, we can talk at length about everything, the diagnosis of what's wrong, and that's important. But tell us in as much detail as you've been able to find, like what is it for? What do they want to create in place of this the status quo?
I mean, a popular mantra within the protests and anyone you talk to is that since 2003, the state created in Iraq has been a state of parties. So it's a state that's for the parties, that serves the parties. It's a state that's been captured by them, where public resources are used to fund the parties themselves or for the personal interests of politicians and affiliated militia groups. And what the protesters and the parties that emerged out of the protests have tried to do is to create a state of citizens. So it's a state that represents ordinary Iraqis, that serves their needs as opposed to the needs of the population. And they've tried to do this through for example, having people who are competent in key positions in government, as opposed to having people in these positions because of their affiliation with a particular party. So this is what they're trying to move towards. And they think that one of the key ways of doing this is by moving away from sectarianism, where sect determines what position you have, what party you vote for, etc.
How do they talk about power? Because as I understand this, and maybe I'm wrong, there have been previous conversations about bringing in technocrats, and the problem there is, you can bring in someone who understands telecommunications or even someone who isn't corrupt, and it doesn't actually matter if they have no power base.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that what the kind of utopian ideal that these parties have been discussing is the idea of not just replacing the people in power, so not just replacing a minister with a technocrat. It's the idea of changing the power relations at the heart of government. So instead of just replacing the people there, they want to change the entire system and the way that it runs. So I don't think that for them the solution is having a minister here and there who might do a better job than someone who's affiliated with one of the dominant parties, for example. The point is to build the system anew in the long term.
And the model of certainly the protests themselves, and I'm guessing of these protest parties, is very counter to the model of the existing factions and parties, right, which are very much top down. I mean, there's even a movement like the Sadrist movement, which has a lot of street power. It is not a grassroots movement in the sense that the membership is not driving the agenda of the party. And certainly in other more powerful and unitary factions, it's the leaders of the factions decide, the Zaim, the bosses decide what's going to happen, and they sort of deploy their followers or their fighters or their voters as they wish. So how overtly is the Tishreen movement and its sort of legacy structures challenging that idea by talking about power and decisions as being something that stems from individuals and Iraqi citizens and people?
I think certainly during the protests, because the people who took part in 2019, many of them had also been involved in the 2015 protests, and they saw how those protests went wrong. And one of the key ways that happened was through this alliance between the Iraqi Communist Party and the Sadrist movement, which for many of protesters in 2019 was a way of selling out, or what they said was that the Iraqi Communist Party had sold out the movement in 2015, and it had done so without the permission or the agreement of the broader movement. So when we got to 2019, this idea of horizontal decision making, where everyone was involved, for example, in statements issued across protest camps, was very much in play. I think in terms of the parties that emerged out of Tishreen, they definitely have popular grassroots basis, but they're also hierarchical in the sense that they have clear leadership structures. And the issue with having the issues they face, because they're really made up of activists, people who don't have any experience in politics, is that they've really started to fall apart because everyone has different agendas. They feel that they should have a say in decision making. So although they've tried to impose this kind of hierarchy, I think it's been quite difficult for them. The other ways that they differ from the sort of establishment post-2003 parties is in terms of their sources of funding. So a lot of them were established and registered with the Electoral Commission, for example, on the basis of donations from their support base. But again, this means that they don't have a lot of money, because a lot of people in Iraq, and especially in the south, where some of these, the big parties that emerged after 2019 have their bases. People don't have extra income that they can use, for example, to donate to a party, or in terms of sort of membership fees. So they've also had issues raising money, for example.
You're listening to Order from Ashes, Century International's podcast. I'm talking with Taif Alkhudary, who is a member of our Shia Politics Working Group, part of the Faith and Fracture Project. And we're talking about the revolutionary parties in Iraq and what sort of new ideas and identities they're creating in Iraqi politics that run counter to the existing sectarian trends. You can read Taif's report at the Century Foundation's website, tcf.org. The report is called Young Revolutionary Parties Are Still Iraq's Best Hope for Democracy. We'll be right back after this break to continue our conversation.
I'm Dahlia Shendlin. At Century International, I lead our research into democratic erosion in Israel and Palestine, in addition to analysis on Israeli foreign policy, Israel and Palestine in the Middle East, and the foreign policy of other countries regarding this region. As a political scientist and a pollster, for decades I've followed the corrosive effects of the occupation on Palestinians and Israelis, especially on democracy. I've been researching the right-wing assault on the Israeli judiciary for years before it took over the national agenda. And as a political advisor, I try to bring these insights to policymakers, especially those committed to advancing Israeli-Palestinian political resolution. You can find Century International's research on the Century Foundation's website, tcf.org.
Welcome back. I'm Thanasi Kambanis. I'm talking with Taif Alkhudary about her research into Iraq's revolutionary parties and what sort of alternatives they've created to the corrupt and sectarian politics that are dominant in the country. Taif, welcome back.
Thanks so much for having me.
So right before the break, you were talking about the problems facing these parties that came out of the Tishreen protest movement, the ways in which they are falling apart now that some of them have positions in parliament, and the difficulties that they have raising money. So I'm actually wanted you to talk a little bit more about the falling apart bit. Like how well have these parties done, or rather, maybe that's the wrong way to put it. What have been the pressures that have made it hard, or if in any cases successful, for these parties to try and create like real political leaders and politburos and comms departments and the things that that make an institutionalized party survive beyond the movement moment that we often talk about in these catalytic revolutionary moments?
Sure. I mean, I think that you kind of touched upon the first point, that many of these people who not only founded these parties, but make up the membership of these parties have no political experience beyond partaking in protests or even just taking part in the 2019 revolution. And as a consequence, they don't know how to build a party. When I've spoken to people from these groups, they've often said, for example, that they need training on all manner of things. They need to understand how to speak to the media, how to frame their policies, how to organize a political party. You name it, they need it, from what I've heard. And I think that the second thing is many of them have entered politics on this sort of civic or secular, let's say, platform. But the issue is how to navigate this very fractured, highly sectarian political system without being accused of joining sides. So we've seen, for example, one of the parties, Imtidad, which rose from the south of Iraq and, famously won 9 seats during the elections initially. So they've tried, the only way that they've been able to do this is by trying to stay outside of the political system. So saying we're going to stay outside, we're not going to partake in legislation, for example, and we're just going to observe and monitor the workings of parliament. And this is because at the beginning, when they decided to partake and vote for Mohammed al-Halbousi for Speaker of Parliament, a lot of their most prominent members, I think 17 of them, resigned very publicly, saying that they were getting involved in ethno-sectarian politics, which they promised not to do. So now their policy is a policy of negation, but that begs the question of where do they go next with this, and where do they go in the long term, and how they prove to the electorate that they can get things done in Parliament, and therefore that people should vote for them. And how do you create an identity beyond that when all you're doing is staying out of politics? The second thing that's happening is that they're constantly being attacked from the by the establishment parties who have more resources than them, not only in terms of money, but also in terms of arms and weaponry. So again, a member of Imtidad who I spoke to told me that it was really hard for them to come up with particular policy recommendations, because when they had done so in the past, in relation to the Hashid, for example, they were attacked online. There was a campaign against them online, and many of their members were also threatened. So then that begs the question of how do you develop any policy recommendations or partake in politics actively when you're constantly being attacked and you're always on the defense. And the other thing is, and this is what I talk about in my paper, it's about what their ideology means in practice. So, for example, another party that emerged out of the South called the Bayt al-Watani, when I spoke to members of that party, they constantly said that either they didn't know what this meant in practice, or that they just wanted to be part of the Iraqi nation. Others were talking about liberal economic policies, for example, and implementing them more consistently in Iraq. So in practice, their ideology is not revolutionary at all. It remains weak when they try to operationalize it.
Yeah, I mean, I hear several really sort of compelling themes coming out of your work in this report you did, and in general in the sort of interactions with these revolutionary parties. And so a couple of questions leap to my mind. One is, despite their avowed nationalism, there seem to be predominantly Shia parties from the South, and then there's a new generation. It seems largely to be made up of Kurds. I'm not aware if there's a sort of largely Sunni party, but even though these are non-sectarian parties, their membership and geographical base seems to nonetheless break down along the same regional and sectarian cleavages as the main parties. And then, two other points you just raised, and I just want to put a finger on them because I think they're so critical. One is politics. Like these groups largely don't seem to actually be interested in engaging in politics because for all these reasons you described, but the sort of either boring or controversial taking of political positions immediately puts a big strain on the membership. So they just want to avoid, do you have a position on dissolving militias or on regulating the Hashid al-Shabi and the fighters within its context? Do you really want to take on corruption when it's linked to jobs that people are benefiting from, or do you simply want to extend that corrupt network to more of your members? And And then the third strain, which you talked about several times, but I think is so central to understanding this, is that the second any movement with even the slightest credibility touches on the power sources of the status quo factions, whether it's the militias or the many public sources of money from which they steal, they'll be killed. That's the third rail that Iraqis, whether they're social media influencers or poets or political activists, they often are face violence and assassination when they go after specifics of the ways in which the power structure controls people and steals from people. I'm wondering if that's as much a soliloquy as a question, but how those sort of themes fit in with your analysis of this, and whether any of these nascent parties are beginning, even in a sort of inchoate ideological way, to address this sort of big, the sort of central question of how you wrestle power away from these rotten status quo factions.
Big questions there. I think in relation to the first question or the first point you made about how a lot of these parties are Shia parties or made up predominantly of Shia membership, and they're sort of coming out of the southern Iraq, I think for me, this doesn't matter insofar as they are not trying to, firstly, they're not using sectarianism as a tool through which to recruit people or a tool through which to do politics. So they're not saying in their electoral campaigns, I am from the same sect as you, therefore you should vote for me because I will protect your interests. They're not doing that at all. Therefore, I don't think it matters that they're from the South and they're made up of predominantly Shia activists. Secondly, they're actively trying to recruit beyond these spaces. So Al-Bayt al-Watani, in particular, have around 12 offices across the country. So they have a base in Salah ad-Din, they have an office in Baghdad, they have a bunch of offices in the South as well. So they're actively trying to recruit beyond the South and to recruit cross-ethnically as opposed to only focusing on Shia membership or Shia voters. And to some extent, you can say the same thing with Imtidad insofar as it's true that their strongest base is in the South, but they allied with a New Generation, for example, which is this Kurdish party. So in some ways, they are trying to go beyond this, but I agree with you that it's limited because, you still have, for example, in the Imtidad New Generation coalition example, you still have a predominantly Kurdish party allying with an Arab party, let's say. So obviously there are we're not quite there yet, but the parties are taking active steps to move beyond sectarianism. And one of those steps is to recruit cross-country as opposed to focusing on just the South or just Baghdad, for example. And then the second thing is in terms of how anyone who's critical of the government or militias gets killed, I think this is a huge limitation for these parties and will hugely limit what they can achieve and what they can do. And I don't think that there's really any way for them to overcome this. The only thing that I can think of is Al-Bayt al-Watani, for example, are organizing a lot of meetings at the moment, or a series of meetings where they're trying to form a coalition with other parties, civil society groups, civil society activists to think about their strategy going forward during the next elections and what they want. So I guess that's one way to do it, because if you're building coalitions, you're increasing your electoral base, and maybe that gives you leverage. But yes, I agree with you 100%. I think that the fact that anyone who is critical of the government or associated militias gets killed means that their work is going to be super, super limited, whatever they do.
Yeah, in my conversations, my limited conversations, somewhat out of date now with members of these parties. And this was, I guess, around the time of last spring when I think maybe Halbusi hadn't even been elected yet or was about to be elected. So, or early in the government formation in Broglio. What I was struck by was how resolutely the activist leaders I spoke to were trying to avoid getting sucked into politics, which to me seemed understandable, but also inherently limiting. You know, at the end of the day, these groups will have long-term impact on politics and power in Iraq if they are able to have power, to wield power of some sort, whether it's within the government or as critics of the government. And I think that's their aim. But ultimately, Iraqis are sophisticated consumers of their own politics, and they're going to want to know what is your position on all these issues. And ultimately, we've seen in other contexts like Lebanon and Egypt, when revolutionary parties shied away from addressing these core questions that are on everyone's minds when it comes to politics and power. Ultimately, if the parties don't address these things, they drift to the margins.
I agree with you to some extent. I think that a lot of the time, politics in Iraq is not based on a platform or having a sort of action plan for the next 4 years. Rather, people vote on the basis of who sort of paves a road for them that month. So I don't think that the new parties are impacted by that, because I don't think that's how voting works in Iraq. I think what the problem is that these parties made big promises about how they would navigate sectarianism within the political system, and they haven't really been able, not just sectarianism, but the corruption that comes with it as well. And they haven't really been able to date to prove themselves. And because they haven't been able to prove themselves, they've lost a lot of supporters. So there is the example with Imtidad that I mentioned earlier about them voting for Halbusi, and how everyone, or their electoral base, and key members within the party saw this as them being co-opted by the system. And you have this also with Al Bayt al-Watani, who saw huge resignations. At one point, 500 members resigned, and 2 of their offices were emptied, basically. I think at some point they only had 1 member left in Najaf. And this was because the general secretary of that party was seen to have allied, or at least become affiliated with the Sadrists, by basically nominating someone or supporting the nomination of someone who'd ran as an independent with the Sadrists in 2018, in the 2018 elections. And so I think this is the bigger issue, and this is why they're losing supporters, because they're seen to have been co-opted. And it goes back to this idea about, one, their membership base being mostly activists, so they have high expectations, and their support base also being activists who aren't tempering their sort of expectations to what is possible within Iraqi politics. And I think this is why people will not vote for them in 2, 3, 4 years' time.
So last question. To the extent there is one, what is the ideology of Tishreen? Should we think of it as secular, civic, nationalist? Like, what's your thumbnail sketch of what is the emerging alternative to sectarian patronage politics, which I think is the prevailing political ideology of Iraq's dominant factions today?
I would say it's a unitary nationalist identity. So it is the idea that instead of being represented on the basis of your sect, you're represented in politics on the basis that you are Iraqi and that you are an Iraqi citizen. And in this way, I think that what the protesters and the parties that came after them were thinking is that then the state would not discriminate against you or that the state would basically represent everybody equally. And it's also a transformation of the state so that it represents Iraqis as opposed to representing and serving the needs of the political parties. I think that this is what Tishreen has developed.
And to me, I think that's a very powerful idea, and I think it's a direct existential threat to the entire array of existing parties, because analytically we come up with this problem all the time when someone will ask, what is the difference between Maliki and Sadr on policy? And you're like, is it even possible to describe policy differences between these factions? And I find for the most part it isn't, right? Because they're not groupings based on any kind of, as you said, anything other than sect baiting. We will protect you as Shia, as Kurds, as Sunnis against, some other. And the second that there's a entity on the scene that's talking about all these things in a different way, that lays bare the sort of rottenness and hollowness at the core of the sectarian parties.
Mm. Yep. And I think that this, to go back to your point about violence as well, I think that this threat. So what we saw in 2018 was that an increasing number of parties affiliated with militias entering parliament. And as a consequence, when the protests broke out in 2019 and there was this existential threat, you had this huge increase in armed actors who now had a stake in the political system in the way it is, and basically did whatever they could to protect their stake in it. And I think this is why we've seen this huge increase in coercion from 2019 onwards. And even in the aftermath of the big mobilization, we saw something like 30 activists, political activists, assassinated for that reason. So I think that this idea of an existential threat really increased after 2019, but also the type of actors that were facing the threat changed. And therefore, you saw this huge increase in coercion that we had never seen before, not in the 2015 protests, not in the 2011 protests, not to this extent.
Thank you so much. We've been talking with Taif Alkhudary about her recent report, Young Revolutionary Parties Are Still Iraq's Best Hope for Democracy. It's part of Century International's Faith and Fracture project, which looks at the transformation of Shia politics in Iraq over the last 20 years and what it tells us about sectarian and Islamist politics more widely. Taif, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
You can find Taif's report and the other parts of this project at the Century Foundation's website, tcf.org. I'm Thanasi Kambanis, and you've been listening to Order from Ashes. The Order from Ashes podcast has been brought to you by Century International. Our work builds on more than 100 years of commitment to international peace, security, and governance at the Century Foundation. We are independent, critical, and progressive. For more information about Century International's work, please visit tcf.org or follow us on Twitter and Facebook. We depend on audience feedback to reach new listeners. If you like what you hear, please leave a review wherever you get your podcasts.